Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
Welcome back for chapter 6, Sunakkhatta the Traitor. I'm fighting off a cold right now, so I may sound a little funny today. But one of the things that Mitchell and I were just talking about is, first of all, I didn't say this time. I think we used to say it a lot when we did the Crazy Wisdom thing. But I like to recommend whenever I do a book study kind of thing like this to read chapters again rather than reading ahead. And I'm suggesting that for our listeners now because that's what I'm doing as we record this episode. And I'm getting a couple reads in on these chapters. And it really helps. I mean, I think everybody's probably had the experience of reading a Dharma book once and you come back to it a year later or something and it's like a whole new Dharma book. I can tell you that even within a couple days, you can have a whole other kind of experience of teachings from a section. And so I want to make that recommendation of like trying to maybe read, if you're waiting for the next episode, if you're trying to go along with us, like read a chapter again rather than jumping to the next chapter and let that material really kind of sink in as you move through your week. And the second thing I wanted to talk about up front, we're about halfway through the book. And so I've been kind of thinking about some of the themes I'm seeing develop over all the chapters, like kind of being revealed. And one of them I think that's interesting is like we're on the third biographical sketch. And I think this is the first time I think that you really see how he's telling this story of Northern India at the time of the Buddha and like this tumultuous time and it kind of telling it through each of these people. And I feel like now we see like, oh, like this was a chapter where we jump back and hear about, this was happening at the same time as Pasenadi was, saying goodbye to the Buddha, and Mahanama was, underwater trying to save his people. It's like there's this story being revealed about the whole kind of area. And I think it's really impressive feat of storytelling, the way he's kind of going about revealing this story of the same kind of event, the same time, but through these different people, and all of them close to the Buddha. And it's stuff that I knew nothing about before. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that particular aspect?
Well, yeah. So I would agree that for me, this chapter was kind of where that obviously started to stick out, just because of I forget the names, but yeah, a couple of the story threads kind of wove together in a cool way. And I mean, I was telling you before we started, I mean, just general thought on that is that my historical knowledge, about the context that what we now call Buddhism sort of came up out of was pretty limited before reading this book. So yeah, it's just definitely been cool to learn something about that. And I guess what kind of stuck out to me in this chapter, we'll get to that more as we go through the sections, but like some of the stuff going on at this time is not very different from the stuff still going on today, like both kind of in our minds and in our experience that we might have relating to the Dharma, as well as just worldly events, same sort of things happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Same intrigues, same power struggles. Yeah. There are two things I wrote down as like themes. One of them was that kind of storytelling about Northern India. And then another one is the development of canon. Like what is canon? What, who determines canon? Like what is canon made up of? Various kinds of canon. I learned from here and then did a little more research that the Pali Canon was actually considered closed around the 3rd century CE. And last week, I think on a break, Mitchell asked me a question about whether this book gets to the second and third turnings of the Wheel of Dharma, which is a phrase that is not specific to Tibetan Buddhism. I would say it's probably Mahayana, any kind of Mahayana tradition. But it got me thinking about that second and third turning thing, because I know some of our listeners have probably heard about that before too. And And it got me thinking also about the idea of Buddha Vachana, like words of the Buddha, and frankly, like I came to recognize this week, like I was thinking about those second and third turnings, which are not in that original Pali Canon. And I think the question often comes up, like, did the Buddha teach those, and I think I always was kind of inclined, because the methods worked, because I was introduced to the methods and the methods worked, to just believe that the Buddha taught them. And I still kind of do. I believe, like he described Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha in the sutras, often being the words of other people expounding the Dharma at the Buddha's behest or with his approval. I do believe that the Buddha taught the second and third turnings, but I'm a lot less inclined to believe that Gautama did. And I kind of realized I don't know that I ever believed that Gautama did. I was always skeptical of this idea of like, well, there was this set of teachings that he didn't do publicly, but they came out 500 years later, and he taught them. And
right.
I mean, if you believe that, that's great. I'm not trying to knock the belief, but I know it kind of helped me to have a framework to recognize, like, I think those turnings are valid, but I don't think the historical Buddha taught them, as a person teaching them to somebody else. But that doesn't diminish their validity to me at all, because I know from experience what amazing teaching methods are in those second and third turnings. And it perfectly aligns, I think, with the Dharma taught by Gautama. And I think that's another kind of this idea of pedagogy and Dharma. Like, maybe all Dharma is pedagogy in a way, but I see like second and third turnings as kind of just like a different pedagogy, like a different method of teaching these things. And I've just been really I think I really had not been able to clarify before that idea in my mind, that like there are always going to be methods we're using to teach Dharma, and we need to at least be aware that there's some overlap there, but like I don't think we can say that the method is the Dharma, or maybe you can. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, always kind of been like a talking point for us, because of the tradition that we studied. And this actually came up as well in my Sunday afternoon meditation the other day, because in our discussion, we were talking about this book. I mean, I was just kind of talking about my experience of reading the book and sort of recommending it because I think it's insightful and, all the things we've said on this podcast. But it sort of goes back to like the anecdote in here about how there were teachings that the Buddha gave, and then sometimes he would let one of his followers talk, and he would basically just say, yeah, like basically what he said, that's right.
That's what he said.
Yeah, exactly. And like what you're saying is kind of the same logic, right? Like if through the years there's masters or practitioners who have developed their realization and revealed the Buddha within, so to speak, then the methods that they teach that will help others do the same thing are valid. So on a certain level, it doesn't really matter whether the historical Buddha did or did not teach the tantric methods or whatever, because like the Buddha, big Buddha, did teach it, so that and then I think one thing that we talked about on Sunday, because like we always kind of try to tie it all back into just like practical value, and I think that's maybe what our teachers did as well. And like at the end of the day, if you really pushed them on it, they would probably say, I mean, I obviously can't speak for anybody, but I feel like there's a certain sentiment of like, it doesn't really matter because like you said, if the practices work, they work. And that's what really matters. It's kind of like there's certain threads in the book that confirm that thinking too. Like the whole idea of you get shot by the arrow, which it will come up again in this chapter. It's like being too preoccupied by who did or did not shoot it. I mean, it's like, okay, like doesn't really matter, because we want it to come down to like practical impact. So yeah, I guess that would be kind of, I always feel good about bringing the discussion back to that, because I think it's true. We have to keep in mind, like, we're trying to basically develop practices that will allow us to relinquish reactivity, to speak in the terms of this book. So that's the main thing to focus on. And like whatever we can learn that supports that is good. Like, I always love learning about the historical stuff from like a intellectual point of view. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just have to make sure that we're focusing on the practical side of things too. And I mean, I love the stories about, I guess, what we would call the traditional origins of Vajrayana stuff. I mean, it's like they're super cool stories. Who knows what's true or what's not true? But like the whole idea of the Buddha having this like late life period where he was just dropping these bombs,
Yeah.
like here's how it really is, kind of. But I mean, it's like, it's easy to kind of maybe criticize people who are a part of our tradition for it could come off as a little arrogant in a way. It depends on how you hold it, I guess. But like, for us to say that we have these teachings that are like more definitively true than others, that the Buddha sort of revealed late in life to select people. I mean, it could be true. I mean, it's just kind of like tricky territory. I think we have to be sensitive and always note that it's really not a matter of any of it being like higher than others. It's just different needs, like there's the story, the first, I know we probably talked about this in the Crazy Wisdom season, but like the whole, the first revelation of Tantra to King Indrabhuti. It's a good story. It's really cool. And it also has practical impact, I think, for us. Like, it's like a prospective follower who needed a certain kind of teaching to apply in the context of his life. And the Buddha saw that he could handle it. And so he taught it,
Yeah.
And that's what all the teachings are, it's not really better or worse. But anyway, I guess that's my rambling thoughts on all that. The main thing is practice,
Yeah. I appreciate all that. Yeah. And I think like, well, another topic, and not to go this, we could spend a long time on this. We'll do an episode on this. But one thing I mentioned to Mitchell before this episode is I think I've been having the realization that Buddhism, as it comes down to us today, at least in my experience, and things I've heard from a lot of other people too, Buddhism is not trauma informed. So, and I just want to say that because I think I've been realizing it. And I think it's something that people should know, that in many cases, Buddhism is not a trauma informed practice. I think the Dharma is. I definitely think the Dharma is, and I think a lot of the problems happen. Like, I think this book highlights in many ways our attachments, and some of the more subtle but bigger attachments. For instance, to believing that the second and third turnings were taught by the Buddha. And I'm not taking one side or the other here. I'm just saying, like, I'm glad to know that there are forces that drove beings, and to recognize the same forces in myself that drove people to try to lift up certain teachings and suppress other ones, or to try to say like, well, this is really true and this one's maybe not as true. Or, I mean, these are human concerns, like we were saying, even just about the things happening back then happening today. Like, these things are always going on, and I am grateful to be aware of these dynamics that I maybe wasn't as mindful of before. And I'm not knocking one side or the other. I'm just saying I think it's good to know these kinds of things crop up, and and understand that, as being part of how this got to us here today. And like I said, I think in an earlier episode, maybe why these things got to us today. So like, even things that may seem to have somehow, I don't know, I was going to say corrupt, but like turned the Dharma in a way that maybe not ideal. Like, that may also be the reason why we have access to it today. So that's kind of a big, broad point. But the last thing I wanted to mention about that is that I love the idea you said about like the Buddha in the last part of his life just dropping bombs. And the first thing that popped into my head is it's like he had this like Rick Rubin, Johnny Cash period at the end of his life, you know, where he was just like making like his most amazing work, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think about it like that, but that's mainly for the sake of inspiration. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, not that I need to say this for anybody, but I want to say like and I know I've said this probably many times on the podcast. I think we probably both have, like, my faith in my teacher and the teachings and the practices is like greater than it's ever been. And it grows the more I learn about this stuff. So I think one thing I think I've definitely fought, and maybe this is something that Stephen Batchelor talks about too. I think I've definitely fought the sense of like learning something, maybe unraveling some kind of authenticity in my practice. But I don't think understanding things as they are without passion, aggression, or ignorance is a bad thing, you know, or even trying to do it without passion, aggression, or ignorance. I think knowing things and being aware of things is the whole point. And so I still have that sense and that fear that I may be like, you know, that may be something undermining genuine practice, but every time I work through that fear, I see that's not the case. So that's my experience.
Yeah. That's cool. I agree with you. I have similar experience. It's interesting because I don't know that I've really thought to like articulate that, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I might say it a different way, but it's basically the same thing. It's kind of like these areas that you know you have to step past that are like, and you're scared to, because it's like this boundary that's helped you up to now. And then you step past it and you realize once again, you did not lose the essential thing.
Yes.
You know, maybe you actually just see it more clearly. The essential thing becomes more clarified. The more of the sort of non-essential things you let go. And that might get into, you know, it would be hard for us to really lose the essential Dharma, because the essential Dharma is just dealing with our experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And it brought to mind, if you've seen Dune, the Bene Gesserit, the like nun people, there's a really great quote in there that is, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings obliteration. I will face my fear, and I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. I really like that one.
Yeah.
So I think a broader point, like, so to seg into the content here for part one, I think another thing that we've been talking about here, and that this chapter in particular dives into, is just like divinity, the idea of divinity versus like humanity, you know, like just being a human being versus being a god. And the epigraph in this chapter, which is from the Mahasihanada Sutra. It says, now on that occasion, Sunakkhatta, the Lichavi's son, had recently left the Dharma and discipline. He made this statement before the Vasali assembly. The wanderer Gotama does not have any superhuman states, any distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. The wanderer Gotama teaches a Dharma hammered out by reasoning, following his own line of inquiry as it occurs to him. And when he teaches the Dharma to anyone, it leads, when he practices it, to the complete end of suffering. On hearing of this from Sariputra, the Buddha replied, Sariputra, the deluded man Sunakkhatta is angry, and his words are spoken out of anger. Thinking to discredit me, he actually praises me. For it is praise of me to say, when he teaches the Dharma to anyone, it leads, when he practices it, to the complete end of suffering. And the first chapter here says, one of the challenges in recovering a sense of the historical Buddha is to overcome the idealized and archetypal image of Gautama that has been conveyed by Buddhist iconography. According to some of the earliest traditions, he is supposed to have borne 32 extraordinary physical marks, including a fleshy protrusion on his head, wheels of 1,000 spokes on the soles of his feet, projecting heels, extra long fingers and toes, and 40 even teeth with no spaces between them. Though few today would take this description literally, it continues to haunt the imagination. The canon is ambivalent about his appearance. Sometimes he appears like an ordinary person. On other occasions, he is described as a quasi-divine being with barely a trace of humanity. This tension is illustrated in the story of Pukasati. In this Pukasati story, this wanderer, Pukasati, goes to a place to stay somewhere, and there turns out to be another wanderer there. And this other wanderer asks him, like, who's your teacher? And he says, Gautama. And at some point, because this wanderer teaches Pukasati realizes like he's in the presence of the Buddha. Like that is the Buddha. So the story I think was given to kind of show like, here's a situation where somebody was in the same room with him and they had no idea. So like, if we're saying he has 32 amazing marks, why did he not see those, you know? And the commentaries basically say because by an act of will, the Buddha caused his remarkable physical attributes to be concealed. And I thought it was interesting, this story, because there's really like two options of miracles here. He doesn't go into saying this, but if you think about the rest of the chapter, like because he appeared as a normal person, some commentators at some point felt the need to say that the reason that happened was because he had this miraculous ability to transform his semi-divine appearance into a human being. But I also want to point out, if you read through the whole chapter, that the only miracle, it differs, but in one section when he talks about the Buddha and miracles, the only kind of miracle he approves of is instruction. And so I thought it was pretty interesting too, that what happened here is he gave through his instruction that miracle to this person. And even though the person didn't see the miraculous signs or something, because of the power and effectiveness of his teaching, his instruction, he recognized him to be the Buddha. And that's a kind of miracle too. You know, so it isn't just a story about like the mundane appearance of the Buddha. It's also, I see it as a, support for the idea that instruction itself is a miracle, you know, and he worked this miracle in front of Pukasati and then was recognized, you know?
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't think about that. I know like another way that we maybe would have been explained this would be like that Pukasati's like obscurations prevented him from seeing the Buddha as he really was, and he just saw him as an ordinary person. Something to that effect. Which, you know, it's like all that stuff I guess could be true, but sometimes that sort of thing could just be semantic or just like the way you think about it. Like to say that it was his obscurations that prevented him from seeing the Buddha as he really was could kind of just be the same as just saying, well, he didn't notice at first that it was the Buddha. You know, like sometimes the extravagant language is maybe a little misleading. But I think there might be some sentiment amongst teachers in Buddhism that it was good for students to think about the Buddha as divine. You know what I mean? And it's easy to see the logic of that because, you know, it maybe takes a certain level of maturity to start to relate to the Buddha as a regular person without losing the sanctity around the whole thing. You know what I mean? Because it's like potentially empowering and even more sacred to start to recognize that the Buddha is an ordinary person like us, right? Like that actually makes the whole thing way more impactful. And you know what that actually means is that we're all sacred, right? So that's pretty amazing stuff, but it's also possible that people could, you know, if you introduce that kind of thinking at the wrong time or something, it could cause people to maybe become stagnant in their practice or something, or like lose the urgency of connection to Dharma. And I feel like maybe some of what we might point out as like the sort of religious flaws of Buddhism may have, it's sort of conceivable to see that it could have been a way to like be careful people and take care in the presentation of all this stuff. And I feel like maybe the example of the character in this chapter is actually a good example of that. It's like he couldn't really deal with the ordinary nature of the Dharma.
Yeah.
But it's not really ordinary.
Yes. Yeah.
It's extraordinary, but you can miss it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that relates to, I think last week or the week before when we were talking about how like a lot of this really amazing stuff is totally ordinary. And that's what's amazing about it. And, I'll throw in here too, that he mentions a Brahmanic myth at the time, that I think preceded the life of the Buddha, that there was just some sort of story about someone coming at some point with 32 marks who would be a savior, who was either a monarch or a spiritual leader. And so I think you could see a way in the rearview mirror where it was like, oh, we need to plug him into that myth so that he has more validity in a predominantly Brahmanic culture. Which is, I think, not unlike a lot of the stories. I mean, I don't know them. I probably could have done my research, but the stories about Christmas, like every Christmas, there'll be videos and stuff that come out about how, the holiday was a pagan holiday first, all these different kind of stories were in different traditions before. And, many of them, like the same kind of story was told in different traditions, multiple times before Christ became the main character in that story.
Right.
And so we have, again, these trends are continuing on.
There's this really fascinating book. It's just like a random thought, but so it's a German ethnobotanist, Christian Ratsch, I think is how you say his name. He and his wife wrote this really interesting book called Pagan Christmas. And it just talks about like the sort of pagan shamanic roots of a lot of Christmas and a lot of the imagery surrounding our current Christmas traditions, like kind of some of the roots of all that. It's a pretty interesting read for any Westerner, I would say. Wow.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. And so if this stuff happens, it definitely, history repeats itself.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, I wanted to read this one paragraph, the one that begins the discourse to Sela in the Pali Canon, because I found this one pretty funny. He says, the discourse to Sela in the Pali Canon tells how a Brahmin called Sela hears of the appearance of such a great person and sets out to ascertain whether he possesses the 32 marks. On tracking Gautama down, he examines his body but discovers only 30 of the predicted marks. The two that were not visible were his penis enclosed in a sheath and the unusual length of the tongue. So the Buddha, quote, worked a feat of supernatural power that the Brahmin Sela saw the teacher's penis was enclosed by a sheath. Then Gautama extruded his tongue, repeatedly touched both ear holes and both nostrils, then covered the whole of his forehead with his tongue. And Stephen Batchelor says, a modern reader is likely to find this passage either absurd or comical or both. I was going to say the first thing I thought of was how many abuses of student teachers in the Buddhist tradition have done, and how that's not that different from a lot of the sexually inappropriate things that have happened, in the modern day and over time. I mean, I found that story a little funny, but the second time I went through it, I was also like, so he showed him his penis, according to this story, and then did like tricks with his tongue on his, that's a little much. I mean, but yeah. But again, like, I think we're kind of demonstrating how the canon, like, I think he's trying to highlight how the canon developed, how like we were, there were attempts to rectify seeming contradictions maybe over time. He makes the point that like the people who were keeping these stories by oral tradition, their job was not to do that. But the commentators and the commentaries, that was, I'd never really thought about that difference either, that there were like a set of people that were probably memorizing the teachings, and then there were another set of people who were writing the commentaries, and then those commentarians would be the one who would, try to weave all the disparate sections into something that seems coherent. And I like how he says that the canon is a vast collage of conflicting texts with, singly or in clusters, were cherished in the memories of different groups of followers. So you kind of have all these unique nuggets of information or teachings or anecdotes that probably are particularly important, maybe to the people in the town where they were said to have happened, or, some particular context. And all of those kind of ended up in the soup. And then, and then we end up with a canon, which is probably in all cases outside of Buddhism too, a little messy.
Definitely.
And I also feel like that is a topic. I wrote down this quote too. He says, their job was to preserve what was handed down. It fell to the commentators to resolve the internal conflicts and contradictions. And it struck me, that was kind of the last thing in this part one. And it struck me as like, kind of a big topic to just kind of introduce and then leave. So I don't know if we're going to revisit that or not, but I just kind of wonder, is the implication that the commentators, in order to rectify seeming contradictions, like serially leaned into magical explanations, or that at a minimum there's like a bias towards that, like if things seem to contradict each other or to be unlikely, like was the answer always to just go for some divine magical thing and then it's solved?
Right. Yeah.
So moving on to part two. Part two starts, Sunakkhatta, whose life will be told in this chapter, was an idealist who yearned for mystical experiences and metaphysical certainties. Despite his proximity to the Buddha over many years, he failed to grasp what was distinctive and liberating about the Dharma. The flesh and blood Gautama constantly undermined his unrealistic projections. And Batchelor explains how Sunakkhatta is only mentioned 4 times in the canon. He is, I really tried to get some of these names of tribes and areas learned, or at least so that I can be clear about them, even though I know it's a bit confusing. And so if you're not following on, what country King Ajatasattu is from and things like that, I think it's okay. If you read the book, it'll probably make more sense. But I'll say that Sunakkhatta is introduced as a Licchavi son, and the Licchavis were a tribe that were known for wild qualities, martial qualities, but also loyalty and ability to live simply. And the Licchavis were the dominant clan in the Vajjian Confederacy, which is one of the last independent republics in northern India. And Gautama warns that they, if they get lazy, they will become vulnerable to invasion by King Ajatasattu of Magadha, who pops up again later in this story. And the Vajjian Confederacy was governed by a council of chiefs, and that's important to know because that's the council that Sunakkhatta denounced the Buddha to this governing council. And at this time in this area, there was a rivalry among the Licchavis between followers of Gautama and followers of Mahavira, who is the founder of Jainism. And he points out that they used many of the same words to refer to their leaders and the same words for the goal of their practice, moksha and nirvana. They both have Mara as what is to be overcome. They both have 5 precepts, 3 jewels. So there were a lot of similarities, it sounds like, in these traditions. And there were several debates at the time between Gautama and the son of the founder of Jainism. And it was said at these debates that only some of the Licchavis paid the Buddha respect, but the Buddha, at least according to the Buddhist canon, the Buddha won the debates, and but his opponent did not admit defeat and become a follower of the Buddha, as was the tradition at that time. This was I know we've talked about it before, but this was a thing where you would go and you would debate, and whoever lost the debate, they became a follower of the person they lost the debate to. So I think what I took away from this part in some is that like there are a lot of examples of how the Buddha was not like the main figure in this Lichavi community. There was always some divisiveness. He was a divisive figure, according to Stephen Batchelor, and even before Sunakkhatta's denunciation. So like Stephen Batchelor says that he had to be careful there not to offend those who opposed him. So I feel like when I think of him being there, I have like a sense of like probably he had to flex his political muscles and be careful and teach in ways that probably had to be, context specific at the time. And that's my sum of part 2. Did you have any thoughts or notes about part 2?
I kind of along those lines. I mean, my main takeaway was kind of just that it was interesting and in a way kind of refreshing, I guess, to consider that the Buddha was in a way like a regular part of worldly conflict and controversy. Like he was just part of the situation. I think that is a refreshing snapshot of what was probably true, like for me right now. And probably, just the idea of him being a part of some kind of a normal everyday life set of circumstances, people who think differently, and being a part of all that.
Yeah. Having to think about keeping supporters so that his teaching can spread there. That's stuff we still think about. So, yeah. So then we jump to part 3, which begins... The passages where Sunakkhatta appears in the canon provide us with just enough information to construct a chronology of his relationship with the Buddha. These episodes offer a consistent portrait of Sunakkhatta as a vacillator and an idealist, someone who, despite his proximity to Gautama, repeatedly fails to understand what is distinctive about what Gautama says. He explains in this section a bit about Adimuti, which is like the Buddha said at one point, if a person is dedicated to worldly things, only talk of that interests him. It is all he thinks and ponders about, and he associates with similar people. The opposite of that would be turning one's mind towards the spiritual. So he says, as long as a person is fettered by his dedication to worldly things, he will be incapable of taking an interest in anything else and remain stuck in that frame of mind and that company. Once he becomes disillusioned with mundane affairs, however, the person might dedicate himself to realizing inner states of imperturbability, in which case he will lose interest in worldly concerns. The process is entirely natural. When one's interests move on from worldly to spiritual matters, one's former concerns, says Gautama, drop away like yellowing autumn leaves. But he goes on here to warn about the jhanas, which I don't think we've ever talked about on the podcast before, and I can't claim to know a whole lot about. But I think the idea here is about not getting distracted by meditative experiences. We could probably say any experiences, and we may learn something about this because the next chapter is titled Experience. But the idea here is like there is a pitfall in turning the mind towards the spiritual here, because it could become a new kind of clinging to specific states of meditation. And so that's where I'll leave it right now. Did you have any thoughts up to this point? Because the jhanas, can you say something about, you may know more about that than me. Like why do we not hear about those that often?
So you're talking about like the progressive phases of absorption or whatever?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know much about them. My answer to why we didn't learn too much about that is simply because I sort of think our teachers, from, I guess, the Mahamudra point of view, recognize that to maybe be an unnecessary preoccupation and just, skipped over it, basically. Like, that's not really the point of what we're trying to pursue.
Yeah.
Which is encouraging to me, because I believe what we were trying to pursue was recognition of nirvana.
Yeah. It's funny. I had
the vocabulary of the book here.
Yeah, funny the stuff that pops into my mind, but it just occurred to me that like I remembered when I was driving down to see those fish shows, the first ones after the COVID break in 2021, and I was driving. I guess I was probably maybe in Arkansas by this point, and headed to the Arkansas show, and I was running a little late. I was hoping I was going to make it on time, and I remember seeing Uranus Fudge Factory. Have you ever heard about those or seen those? And they have the funniest signs, like we'll pack your fudge. I mean, it's literally a fudge shop, and
yeah.
You can find them on Instagram. They're pretty funny. So there's all the different kind of sayings about, with all the word games with that. And so I don't know why that came to my mind, other than the fact that in that moment, I thought I really want to stop and see Uranus, but I had to get to the fish show. And if I had stopped there, I would have got, I would have been looking around. I would have probably been spending money I shouldn't be spending, and I wouldn't be getting to the place I'm trying to get to.
Right.
And so I bring up Uranus Fudge Factory as an example of how the jhanas can be a detour on the way to where we're going.
Yeah.
And I think I may be the first person ever to use that example.
Probably so. I would think. And you might have had a really good time there.
Yes.
And I feel like that actually does speak to, I think another formal point about that would be that it simply will slow down or prevent you from realizing the actual goal of the practice more quickly. And because of the Mahayana sentiment that our tradition was informed by. I think that there genuinely was like a sense of positive urgency, around the whole thing. Like, we need to wake up as quickly as possible so that we can be of benefit to beings more quickly. And that still rings as like a good message to me, not that we need to be in the state of mind of like, let's rush through everything, but like, distractions that are not necessarily going to bring us to the real result, so to speak, maybe we should, just be careful about that.
Yeah, I agree. And so there's some discussion, if it hasn't revealed itself yet, I think you probably have, I'm sure we've all noticed already that like he doesn't really give any it was this or it was that. Like, he just does a lot of showing us that, like, sometimes he said this, sometimes he said that, sometimes people said this, sometimes people said that. And so he does talk a little bit about the Buddha describing some of the value of some of the jhanas. So there is some of that too. But a quote I wrote down was, in the course of educating Sunakkhatta, Gautama appears to be outlining a path that steers clear of both a dedication to sensual indulgence and a dedication to jhanas that lead to non-ordinary states of mind. His concern is to focus Sunakkhatta's attention on the ceasing of reactivity, which is nirvana. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but there's this potential to mistake our dedication to nirvana, potentially by getting hung up on these non-ordinary states, to kind of mistake that as the end goal, when it's really that letting go of reactivity. And that's what our practice should be bringing about. The fruit of the practice should be less clinging to reactivity and more ability to let that go and do the 4 tasks as described here. And this is where the analogy of the arrow comes back up. And he quotes the Buddha saying, "One obtains nirvana by removing the arrow of reactivity so that no trace of the poison of ignorance remains in the body." And I want to read that description because there's a very thorough description here of this metaphor. And it is, to realize the freedom from reactivity that is nirvana is a matter that requires considerable care and attention. The Buddha explains to Sunakkhatta that the practitioner of the Dharma is like a man who has been wounded by a poisoned arrow, and his friends and relatives brought a surgeon who would cut around the wound with a knife, probe for the arrowhead with a probe, then pull out the arrow and expel the poison. One attains nirvana by removing the arrow of reactivity so that no trace of the poison of ignorance remains in the body. This operation is achieved by applying the probe of mindfulness, sati, and the knife of understanding, prana, as taught by the surgeon, the Buddha. No mention is made here of the need to attain imperturbability or practice the immaterial jhanas to accomplish this task, but clearly a steady and focused mind will be indispensable in using such surgical instruments effectively. And that metaphor extends into post-surgical care, where he talks about being extra careful with ourselves kind of after glimpses of nirvana, and how we can't believe that like beholding nirvana like makes us forever safe. And one of the quotes here is, one's dedication to nirvana needs to be maintained even when reactivity and ignorance have been removed. And that reminds me of our conversation a couple weeks ago about forward motion, like having some sort of motion in our practice. But it also reminds me of the stories we always hear about our teachers just continuing to practice. Like you just keep on keeping on, there's that forward motion no matter what.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we've talked before about how like there may never be like a final resting point. Realization develops in the sense of constant attention and awakeness, like in a way, like making a continual choice rather than arriving somewhere and then never having to do anything again,
Yeah. I mean, I think it relates to our conversations. I can't remember if they're on mic or off mic, but just the general conversation about how this material can be challenging. Like, I think that feeling that space of certainty being challenged is good. I like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So this chapter closes with the Buddha really just kind of giving these warnings about how, using this surgery metaphor and the need to like eat right and take care of the wound and all these kind of things, and to not get distracted by any kind of accomplishment. And it's said that Sunakkhatta was happy with this explanation from the Buddha, and it may have been part of why he chose to join the order and become a student of the Buddha. But Batchelor makes the point that whatever the case here, he was clearly warned about fascination with contingent states of mind and worldly accomplishments. So this was a running theme. I'm sure the Buddha was very aware of all this with him too, just as we're becoming aware and recognizing maybe the same tendencies in ourselves, the need for some sort of magic or flash to keep us engaged.
Yeah. One other thing that just kind of occurred to me was, I think he even mentioned in here, like how sometimes we do even still like employ techniques. Like I'm thinking of, obviously some of the stuff we did in retreat, but even shamatha in a way could be considered this, right? Like a technique that kind of does produce a non-ordinary state of mind, but it's done intentionally with the motivation that in bringing that state of mind about, we are then going to use the advantageous condition of that state of mind to gain insight into reactivity, basically. So that's kind of worth noting too, because like sometimes if you do bring your mind and body into a state of some kind of like heightened sensitivity, calm, harmony, whatever, it can be a particularly good time to then go deeper, in insight. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I would just follow that up with like, if you think of an actual example of that, like if you are a meditator and you think about your practice and you think about when you may be feeling like particularly blissful or peaceful in your meditation, and then your roommate knocks on the door or the neighbor starts up the mower, how do you handle that reactivity in that moment? Because if you perceive it as like ruining the meditation, I think you probably need to examine that, we all I've that response for sure, but I think that's really the idea is like, if we've cleared the space to be able to actually examine our reactivity through the practice of meditation. When a chance to do that comes up, we should greet it, positively and with openness and curiosity. And, but I know a lot of times that's exactly the opposite of what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of laughing about I remember Rinpoche in retreat kind of telling us the exact same thing, because it's like, I don't remember exactly how it came up. Maybe it was when he was at lunch one day, but there's just this issue of how like everyone's going to be at a different place in the practice or in the session at a different time. And like, you could be just like right at like a quiet part, and the next person is like snapping Dhamma and doing all kind of crazy stuff.
Bells are ringing and
and I mean, it's basically like chaos, it's like noises going off everywhere. But he was like, that's the practice.
Yes. Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. I don't know that we've talked about that before, but there are so many ritual instruments we use. And then one of them is a drum that Mitchell referenced, the Dhammaru. One's a bell. Like there's also mantra that can be said at varying volumes depending on the individual. And and it is the case. Like I remember when I started doing practices like that at home, like I remember thinking like, my assumption was just for sure there was some way that they synchronized that in retreat. I didn't know what it was, but I was like, oh, well, of course they set it up so that everybody rings the bell at the same time. But you're alone in your rooms, and people are going at different speeds and we're chanting at different speeds. So you never know when you would hear like on the drum or a ding, 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 ding. So like, it's funny to me. It's funny to think about that and think about how annoyed people get sometimes when they can hear, the light din of conversation from another room in the temple. Like that's right. Such a light version of, drums and bells at any moment during your meditation. Yeah.
Funny stuff.
All right. Well, let's jump to part 4. So we hear a story here about the Buddha being in retreat, solitary retreat of some kind. And Mahali comes. I think he's from the Vajrayan Confederacy. He's a Lichavi chief. Mahali comes. He wants to see the Buddha, and he gets in to see the Buddha by getting one of his attendants to tell the Buddha that he has a question from Sunakkhatta, something like that. And so the Buddha comes out of retreat to take this question, I'm sure out of the goodness of his heart. And right now I'm just thinking he probably knew at least the essence of the question in advance, just knowing who his student, But the question was basically like Sunakkhatta had divine visions, but he had yet to have hear divine sounds. And so the question was kind of like, are there divine sounds to be heard? And the Buddha's answer was there are other things higher and more perfect than these, for the sake of which mendicants lead the spiritual life under me. So I think the theme here is many people get obsessed with these non-ordinary states of mind or magical seeming appearances or sounds. But as he points out in here, those could all just be hallucinations, like when those things happen. So we can't get hung up on that. And any thoughts about that metaphor or that anecdote?
Not a whole lot. I mean, my general note about this whole section was sort of just clarifying, like what the Buddha did not teach, so to speak, so I guess that kind of falls in that category. But just more preoccupation with experiences maybe that are not fundamentally liberating.
And I do want to read to that point about what the Buddha did not teach. I do want to read the exchange here when Sunakkhatta comes to inform Gautama that he has decided to leave the order. So this is the exchange. The Buddha asks him, "Did I ever say to you, 'Come, Sunakkhatta, be under my rule'? No, sir. Or did you ever say, 'Sir, I will be under your rule'? No, sir. So, deluded man, who are you, and what are you giving up? Consider how far the fault is yours. Well, sir, you have not performed any miracles. The Buddha says, "Did I ever say to you, 'Come under my rule and I will perform miracles for you'? No, sir. And did you ever say, 'Sir, I will be under your rule if you perform miracles for me'? No, sir. Then it appears that I made no such promises and you made no such conditions. What do you think? Whether miracles are performed or not, the aim of my teaching the Dharma is to lead whoever practices it to the complete end of suffering. So what purpose would the performing of miracles serve?" And Sunakkhatta says, "But sir, you did not make a first beginning known to me." And the Buddha says, "And did I ever say, 'Come under my rule, and I will make known to you a first beginning'? No, sir. So deluded man, who are you, and what are you giving up?" So yeah, this is kind of highlighting what the Buddha doesn't teach and what in the questions the Buddha refuses to answer because they're distractions. And I think of distractions, there are many. We're talking a lot about miracles and stuff here. There's also sections in here where Sunakkhatta's admiration for people who practice self-punishment and deprivation and stuff. But I think we can think of any distraction, that makes us kind of feel good or kind of calm could potentially be a distraction on the path of, finding nirvana and letting go of reactivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciated that he makes the point here in this section of kind of saying like, okay, yeah, Sunakkhatta is maybe he's portrayed as like a little bit of a ridiculous figure here or like exaggerated, but that he embodies proclivities that many of us might share, which is, I think, an important practical point. Like, I mean, these are tendencies that we could all become involved with, even just subtly, so I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. And like I guess it's just important that we don't start to think like, oh, like this is this exaggerated example and I could never end up like that.
I don't even know what divine sounds are, so that couldn't be me.
Right.
Yeah.
And like we may not end up just like this, but we could be doing some small version of it,
Yeah.
Yeah, or some version of it that we're not even really aware of. I mean, just good to kind of make it personal, I guess, is my point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the most obvious example that comes to my mind about those potential things, diversions, would just be like how we feel about our meditation practice on a given day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We may not be trying to hear divine sounds, but there are a lot of days where I sit down and I always do a window of tolerance practice first, with the trauma informed side of it. So the first thing I always do is just take a second to notice where I land on a spectrum between spaced out and hyper focused, and really just kind of notice. The first thing I do is I observe how's my mind today? Like, what's my mind doing? What's the mental weather today? And then I try to like accept that and move into the practice. As long as I'm in my window of tolerance, I proceed, and sometimes that means being at like a 7 or an 8 of agitation, like just thoughts keep coming one after the other, or I can't stop thinking about a certain thing, but I still proceed. As long as I'm in my window of tolerance, I still proceed. If I'm outside my window, I'll go do something else, but it is very much like, I think that acceptance of a situation as it is so important. And I think that's probably the most common potential diversion of this variety that doesn't seem anywhere near as exciting as divine sounds, but I think it's something we all get a little hung up on sometimes. There's definitely days where I go, all right, I'm going to meditate, but my mind's racing, and I kind of think that's a bad thing, but we've got to be able to be awake even when our mind's racing or when we're spaced out. Like, we still need to try to practice in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Another thing from the section, I think right after what you quoted, he says, "Indeed, the various forms of Buddhism that we know today have all come to pander to such yearning in one way or another." Yeah, I think that's a little bit like what we've been talking about with like maybe the need for some magic or the need for some divinity, like maybe that actually does help people to engage a little bit. And this section goes on to talk about miracles and how the Buddha talked about miracles. And he mentions 3 kinds of miracles: supernormal powers, such as flying or multiplying one's body, telepathy, and instruction, as we mentioned earlier. And the Buddha says that he accepts that the first 2 are possible. It is possible to have supernormal powers and telepathy. But he says, seeing the danger of such miracles, I dislike, reject, and despise them. And the only miracle he ends up accepting is that of instruction. And the quote here is, what is truly miraculous is that human beings can learn to think and act different and thereby transform themselves. And I don't know that I ever thought about that as a miracle, but wow. Yeah, I think it really, like the way he said it, like, yeah, that is the biggest miracle. And he goes on to, he asks a Brahmin about this same point. And the Brahmin kind of points out that those first 2 kinds of miracles that the Buddha rejected are really only experienced by the one doing them, whereas the instruction benefits the one it's given to. So it has to be the most excellent. The quote was, the true miracle is that instructions have been given that will lead to the experience of nirvana. The rest is just magic. I wrote down, Sunakkhatta demonstrates a common desire for the refuge, the false refuge of certainty. And it could be like metaphysical certainty or religious or otherwise, but this need for certainty can become a distraction on the path. And I think this relates to like experiences I've had and maybe you've had and listeners as going through this book, like there's some challenging of certainties that comes up. And I think that it's good that we notice how that affects us when certainty is challenged, because there are other certainties that maybe aren't as explicit that are operating that will hurt a lot more when they're challenged, like mortality, and like affluence, like there's just so many things that we, without explicitly thinking about it, are certain about, and
Right.
So I think it's good that any practice of getting used to uncertainty is positive.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then Sunakkhatta's need to see miracles and be given these metaphysical truth makes him like the man wounded with the arrow in the metaphor, who before letting his helpers help him and remove the arrow, he's demanding to know who made the arrow and where did they get the wood from and where did they mine the arrowhead from? So really, rather than following the Buddha's teaching, which is about removing the arrow of reactivity, he's getting hung up on irrelevant questions and experiences and bits of information or certainties. So anyway, Sunakkhatta's on his way out the door. Apparently, the last thing Gautama does is kind of remind him that he has spoken highly of the Buddha to the Vajrayans, and that if he leaves, it might give the others the impression that he couldn't hack it as a mendicant in Gautama's order. But Sunakkhatta leaves anyway.
Yep.
Bye-bye. So when we get to section 5, this starts out with another reference. I think he talked about this book earlier, this encyclopedia of Pali names. And this is another one of those sections where another thread is coming back up into the forefront about suffering and reactivity and things that we discussed in the 4 tasks chapter. So the section here, the entry for Sunakkhatta in this encyclopedia of Pali names, a section of it says that Sunakkhatta went about defaming the Buddha, saying that he had nothing superhuman and was not distinguished from other men by preaching a saving faith, that the doctrine preached by him did not lead to the destruction of sorrow, etc. And Batchelor asked the question, did the scholar make a mistake? Because we just read the epigraph where he said it does lead to the end of suffering. So his hypothesis here is that it may have felt kind of crazy for Sunakkhatta to supposedly insult the Buddha by saying that his path leads to the end of suffering. And he uses a couple metaphors of like, it would be like insulting a priest for saying that the result of his practice is the kingdom of heaven. That should be exactly what the outcome is. So I think what Batchelor's saying here is that the text that has come down to us might be corrupt with that word suffering, like that word somewhere was put in, and instead that the complete end of suffering, or that the text must have, as Batchelor says, referred to a goal that Sunakkhatta and his audience would have regarded as unworthy or inadequate, and Gautama would have regarded as eminently admirable. So if this was going to make sense, like the thing that he was saying would have to be something that seems not worthwhile, but of course the Buddha would be like, oh, thank you for saying that about me. So the possibility that he comes up with is that it could well have been the word tanha, or reactivity, as this was actually the main point of that discourse to Sunakkhatta when he teaches him the metaphor of the arrow of reactivity. But Sunakkhatta aspires to, as we've seen, a whole lot more than that. Hence his obsession with self-punishment and miracles and divine sounds. And so this hypothesis of Batchelor's that this should be reactivity, he says, also aligns with what we talked about in the 4 Tasks chapter. And he says, or the Buddha said, this is the ceasing of suffering, the graceless fading away and ceasing of that reactivity, tanha, the letting go and abandoning of it, freedom and independence from it. And he talks about how we've already spoken about how if suffering is birth, aging, sickness, and death, the ceasing of suffering would have to entail the ceasing of birth, aging, sickness, and death. But we know the Buddha was an embodied being. There are other enlightened beings who are also embodied, and they meet with birth, aging, sickness, and death. And furthermore, the Buddha describes nirvana as being immediate and clearly visible, to which Batchelor asserts that this has to be an embodied person. I don't know that I totally follow his logic there. I mean, I get it, but I feel like he doesn't say enough about that. But I think if we're saying it is immediate and clearly visible, the idea here is that there has to be an embodied person who experiences that, who would then also be subject to birth, aging, sickness, and death. So long story short here, he's saying that it's not the ceasing of suffering, it's the ceasing of reactivity. And when we use the pocket quote, the Buddha said, I teach suffering in the end of suffering, that it would more likely be, I teach suffering in the end of reactivity. And all that to say, because I think the next thing, that's about all I have for this one. But yeah, the last thing is, he mentions this phrase, hammered out by reasoning, and uses it to point out that it appears that at this point, Sunakkhatta was kind of just finding, to his perception, the Buddha to be just merely an intellectual. Like, hammered out by reasoning was not a compliment in other places in the book. The last sentence in this part says, in the end, Sunakkhatta concluded that the Buddha was just a fallible intellectual, still trying to figure things out, who could imagine nothing more exalted or transcendent to aspire for than the ending of reactivity.
Yeah. I like all that because I find it helpful or a useful contemplation, to think about the Buddha as having been criticized and having his, what I would consider profound teachings, reframed to sound very ordinary and like ultimately kind of like misunderstood, but the reason that I'm saying that I find that useful and encouraging in a way is just because I'm not going to speak for all of us, but like lately I've kind of noticed that I still have some real work to do in terms of being okay with being taken the wrong way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like hating being misunderstood, or like maybe like something you say is taken the wrong way, and just the idea of people thinking ill of you in some way, it's just like that's a constant kind of practice, and like it's inevitable. I guess what I'm, it's like I could just say what I'm saying by like even the Buddha, experienced that, and it's I think that's a real illustration of the fact that is probably just an inevitable part of life, is that like somebody will not like us, will misunderstand us, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of just have to like check yourself and then be okay with it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates for me a lot. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. We're never going to be in a place where everybody likes us and understands exactly what we're saying. And
Yeah. I'm thinking of some Seinfeld episode. I'm not going to be able to like quote the exact one, but there's this woman, maybe somebody that Jerry's dating, like doesn't like George, and he can't stand it, you know?
yeah.
And it's not for any clear reason. I mean, obviously George could be considered annoying. But like this lady just doesn't like him. I think anyway. And Elaine, they're sitting in the coffee shop. Elaine's like, "Does everyone have to like you?" And George is like, "Yes, I must be liked."
I think I agree, unfortunately. Well, then we move on to part 6. And this starts out talking about the great discourse on the lion's roar, which is what includes, which is, I think, what most of this is drawn from. Sunakkhatta's denunciation of the Buddha is in this discourse, and that's followed by Gautama's rebuttal. And in it, he claims all the supernatural powers referenced earlier as not being approved of, as actually being the proof of his enlightenment. So the Buddha says here, the teacher enjoys the various kinds of supernormal power. Having been one, he becomes many. Having been many, he becomes one. He appears and vanishes. He goes unhindered through a wall or mountain as though it were space. He dives in and out of the earth as though it were water. He walks on water without sinking as though it were the earth. Seated cross-legged, he travels in space like a bird. With his hands, he touches and strokes the sun and moon. He then declares that with the divine ear element, the teacher hears both divine and human sounds, and he encompasses with his own mind the minds of other beings. And Batchelor says, what are we to make of this? The miracles of supernormal power and telepathy, which Gautama elsewhere compared to mere conjurer's tricks that he disliked, rejected, and despised, are now being treated as the necessary accomplishments of a Buddha. Likewise, the ability to hear divine sounds, about which he had told Mahali, there are other things higher and more perfect than these, for the sake of which mendicants lead the spiritual life under me, is now presented as a sure sign of his own pure, perfect enlightenment. Which of these two accounts are we to take seriously? There's really no answer, obviously, to that question, but I think that he uses this to highlight that there's lots of potential conflicts that can come up in organizing these discourses. And he actually brings up the idea that like this could be a conflict that was existent at the time of the Buddha. Like there could have been some conflict about whether these miracles were important or not. But it could also have been later on when people were compiling the text, changes in like maybe the individuals or their communities. And in any case, Batchelor posits that this entire discourse with Sunakkhatta and the Buddha's rebuttal may well have been some sort of damage control, in his words. And he says that it turns out that Sunakkhatta may well have been one of the most prominent Lichavi follower of the Buddha. And this would explain why the assembly at Vesali cared at all about what he had to say about the Buddha. And that he, in fact, may have actually been a close long-term attendant of Gautama. Batchelor even cites one of the Jataka tales where he appears in a previous incarnation alongside the previous incarnations of the Buddha, Sariputra, Mogdalana. These are all beings that are people that we talk about as being very close in the circle of the Buddha. And Sunakkhatta's previous incarnation was included in this group. And in that story, in fact, this previous incarnation of Sunakkhatta is criticized for praising the virtues of Brahmins and emphasizing the importance of sacrifices. So there's definitely some history there. But the fact that he was included in that tale is another piece of evidence that, in fact, maybe Sunakkhatta was a long-term important follower of the Buddha. And his words when he went to the Vesali assembly to denounce the Buddha carried particular weight because of that.
I don't think I have anything to add there.
Okay.
It's interesting stuff, though.
Yeah. And then when we move to part 7, he says that because of some references to age in this discourse, we were able to date the departure of Sunakkhatta to the final year of the Buddha's life. And at this time, he points out that the Buddha was old and frail. And in his words, the Buddha's world was falling apart. And this aligns with what we learned about in the life of Pasenadi in a previous chapter, when his son was about to usurp the throne and then invade Sakya, and in the Mahanama chapter of when he was trying to save as many Sakyans as possible from Vidudabha's invading army. And Batchelor says through this series of surprisingly specific chronological details, we're able to see that Sunakkhatta was likely with the Buddha in Sakya when that situation happened. And it was likely around that time when Sunakkhatta told the Buddha he was leaving the order. So, in other words, Sunakkhatta was likely present, or at least very much plugged in to know what was happening at the time when Prince Vidudabha showed up at Sakya and the Buddha was trying to discourage him from attacking and killing all the Sakyans. And so Sunakkhatta was probably around at that time, connected, and probably deeply disappointed that Gautama did not perform any miracles to prevent the tragedy of that invasion and murder of all the Sakyans. So Stephen Batchelor says his failure to resolve the dispute, either by diplomacy or magic, revealed him as a thoroughly ordinary and fallible man. I think he's talking here in terms of like what Sunakkhatta probably thought about that situation, because here was a chance for the Buddha to do some kind of great miracle and prevent this great tragedy, and he didn't. And so that's a likely predecessor to him denouncing the Buddha and leaving the order.
I mean, obviously we're kind of led to think of like, why wouldn't the Buddha intervene? I don't know that I have an answer, but I guess one takeaway from that could just be that like it's easy for us to sort of think that spiritual figures maybe have some sort of power to influence events, or maybe they should take that responsibility at times, but that might just be kind of an unrealistic expectation on our part, because that may not really be their role in this world, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, we don't know all the details of the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also think like if there is some miracle that could occur on a Wednesday, you know, Vidudabha was staying one town over, what about Thursday?
Right.
You know, like maybe he did some amazing miracle and stopped it on Wednesday. Does that mean Vidudabha is going to go home and his whole army is like never going to touch Sakya again, you know?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. The issue of diplomacy is kind of interesting, though. Did he uses that word in here, right?
Maybe. What are you thinking?
Well, just that, like, the possibility, like you're saying, of performing a miracle that would just like stop it is maybe less realistic than if there could have been some kind of, you know, long-lasting diplomacy.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
I mean, that, you know, that sort of thing seems to maybe be a little bit more realistic. Dalai Lama is a good example.
Yeah. Well, and you could see too there where like that would actually cover both angles with Sunakkhatta. So like he didn't do any miracles, and he also didn't just talk to people and make them work it out, you know. But of course, that's not all up to him either. Like that's definitely the individuals. Right. And Vidudabha was clearly very upset. I think, as I recall, that they washed his handprints and footprints off the ground when he left that place. I think that was what initially like made him get that grudge against the Sakyans. Are you ready for part 8?
Sure, yeah.
This does seem like a pretty historically detailed last few sections here. So the first paragraph of this section says, instead of finding a safe haven in Vasali, Gautama arrives in a city where the population is already turning against him. Given the defection of Sunakkhatta, he may well have foreseen that this would happen. We do not know exactly how much time he spends there, but it cannot have been long. And then we go through a description of his journey to these different towns, and we find out that, in fact, Sunakkhatta is probably right in front of him on this journey, maybe a day or two ahead. And at this point, there's also a section here where Gautama praises the Vajrayans for 7 virtues, and he warns that as long as the Vajrayans maintain these virtues, they will never be defeated by force of arms, but only by propaganda or internal divisions. And then we see in this section that, in fact, they don't maintain several of those virtues. So the Buddha moves on to Rajagaha. King Ajatasattu, who had previously tearfully confessed his misdeeds to the Buddha on one of his visits. This time, King Ajatasattu doesn't even come to see him. And in fact, quite the opposite. He sends his chief minister to kind of try and grill the Buddha for information about the Vajrayans so that they can attack and be victorious in their battle against the Vajrayans. So because they think that the Tathagata cannot lie, they send this, the king just sends this minister to find him to try to extract information so that they can do damage to the Vajrayans. And I think this must have been an incredible insult, depressing. And so we're then told that the Buddha heads back to where he came from, to Vesali, which is where he was just publicly denounced and was not welcome, and that he knew now was at immediate risk of being invaded by King Ajatasattu. That's where he went back to. And along the way, we learned that the lives of Shariputra and Moggallana have both ended. They've both passed away. So this is becoming a very sad time, in the life of the Buddha. And so he stays in this grove of this courtesan on Bapali, when he stays in Vesali, or just outside Vesali. And some young Lichavis come and mock the Buddha with like a mocking song. And Batchelor points out the stark difference of this welcome from what he used to receive when he would be met with by kings and local leaders, and who would pay him respects and offer him the finest food and lodging. And things have changed a lot by this point in his life. And this section ends, and as for Sunakkhatta, the Lichavi son, we hear nothing more about him. After denouncing the Buddha to the Vesali assembly, he disappears from the record. That's all I got.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, kind of a bummer ending to the chapter, but yeah. I mean, this is like you said, like this historical stuff, like I feel so much more moved by this stuff now, like knowing the story. Like I don't think I ever really felt like part of it is I think I always thought of the Buddha as the 32 marks, like with a glow around him. And I'm realizing like I appreciate him more now when I'm starting to hear these more human stories, my admiration and my connection is growing, because it's not just that divine image that I'm seeing.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like the overall atmosphere of this last couple section is just like the very real, like human experience that the Buddha probably had of just kind of like being misunderstood and not really seen or valued in a changing world,
Yeah.
I mean, that's relatable, or is going to be relatable for all of us. And as life goes on, we have to find peace of mind and strength and just like some kind of dignity and self-worth and the ability to walk along and keep going no matter what, like even if we're misunderstood or if we don't seem relevant anymore.
Yeah.
And it's kind of crazy to think of the Buddha potentially having that experience. And then from where we sit today, like what actually became of those teachings, I mean, we're still talking about it now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only thing I would add to that is just, how like I often have to remind myself that like whatever's happening in the world around me, really has no impact on my ability to let go of reactivity. Like It may make it harder, but
yeah.
but the opportunity to let go of reactivity is always there. And it doesn't matter what kind of status you have or what kind of community support you have or your physical circumstances. Like, I think that, as long as we are blessed with our faculties, like we can still do this, and there's still a promise of nirvana there. I imagine that was the Buddha's refuge at that point. Cool. Well, next chapter is experience, which seems like, I feel like we kind of primed that one with this chapter. So I'm curious to see where he's going.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Take care. See you next week.
Bye.